Imagine you are, a seasoned construction manager. You've just landed this massive multi-million-dollar infrastructure contract. You bring your favorite trusted crew onto the site. You administer your standard corporate pre-employment drug tests. You fire up the excavators, and you just start moving dirt.
Right. Just business as usual.
Exactly. But then a week later, everything just grinds to a halt. You're suddenly hit with a $1,000 a day fine, your entire project is legally shut down, and the local police are actually threatening to seize your excavators and sell them to pay off your damages. Welcome to the jurisdiction of the Pawnee Nation Tribal Employment Rights Office.
Yeah, I mean, it is a profound wake-up call for anyone who thinks they can just, operate on autopilot out there. That scenario plays out all the time when standard corporate habits blindly collide with tribal sovereignty.
And preventing that exact collision is basically our mission today. So, whether you are tuning in as an incoming commissioner getting ready to enforce these laws, or maybe a tribal stakeholder, or even a contractor stepping onto Pawnee Nation jurisdiction for the very first time, we are giving you the comprehensive blueprint today.
Which is so crucial.
It really is. This is an intensive training-style orientation focused entirely on the Tribal Employment Rights Office, which is pretty universally known as Tero.
Tero. Because if you are managing a busy job site or reviewing compliance plans, mastering these rules isn't just like a polite suggestion. It is the absolute roadmap for ensuring economic fairness, and honestly, it's a strict requirement for doing business on Pawnee Nation lands.
Yeah, and we have a really deep stack of sources driving our conversation for this deep dive today. We're looking at the foundational Pawnee Nation Tero Act, that's Law 9549, along with detailed compliance plan documents, federal partnership details, prevailing wage policies, and, a bunch more.
It's a lot of paperwork.
It's a ton. But before we get to the mechanics of how all this actually works, we need to understand the foundation, right? Like, why does this framework even exist in the first place? And looking at the documents, the legal bedrock of Tero is actually supported at the federal level by Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964.
Which is such a crucial starting point. Because generally, Title VII strictly prohibits employment discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin.
Right.
But there is a very specific, highly intentional carve-out within that legislation that explicitly allows tribal governments to require Indian preference in employment. It basically recognizes that tribes aren't just racial groups, they are sovereign political entities.
Okay, let's unpack this. In other words, it's their land, their rules. They aren't asking for federal permission to set these hiring quotas. They are acting as an independent nation. So Tero essentially functions as this hybrid between a strict economic border patrol and like a highly active community HR department.
I like that comparison.
Yeah.
That's exactly it.
Right. It fiercely guards the resources flowing into the jurisdiction, but it also actively trains, refers, and builds up the local workforce. Because the goal isn't just to punish outsiders, it's to guarantee fair employment and prevent discrimination against Native Americans by any employer operating on Pawnee land.
And that brings us to the core mechanism they use to actually achieve that, which is the order of preference mandate.
Which is super strict, right?
Oh, absolutely. It is not some vague suggestion to, hire locally if you can. It is a strict, tiered system.
Yeah.
First preference for literally any open job goes to members of the Pawnee Nation.
Okay.
Then the second tier is very interesting. It goes to Native American and non-Native spouses who actively contribute to the support of a Pawnee Nation household. And then the third tier goes to other Native Americans.
I want to pause on that second tier for a second because it really reveals the underlying logic of the whole law, including non-Native spouses might seem, counterintuitive at first glance. But it makes perfect sense when you realize Tero is fundamentally about economic self-sufficiency. If a non-Native person is married to a Pawnee citizen and they're supporting that household, a paycheck going to them is a paycheck staying inside the Pawnee community. It's all about keeping the wealth generated on the land physically inside the homes on the land.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it is about household economics, not just individual demographics. It's nation building.
Yeah.
And to ensure these workers are protected once they actually, get the job, Tero maintains a formal, direct partnership with the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission.
Oh, wow. So they're directly tied to the feds.
Yeah, meaning Tero isn't just a basic placement agency. They work hand in hand with federal authorities to protect against workplace harassment and enforce those Title VII rights directly on the ground.
So we've established the why. It's an exercise of inherent sovereign power to keep economic opportunity within the community. But, a law is really only as good as its enforcement. So who actually wields the power to enforce these preferences? And where does that power even apply? Because the scope of the jurisdiction described in the Tero Act is massive.
It's incredibly broad. It covers trust lands, fee lands, restricted and trust allotments, and basically any entity doing business within those geographical boundaries.
Yeah.
And this is a critical point that a lot of people miss. It doesn't just apply to outside contractors from another state. Even internal tribal commercial enterprises have to follow Tero laws.
Wait, really?
Yeah. For example, the tribe's own TDC, the Tribal Development Corporation. They must comply with Tero, just like anyone else. No commercial entity gets a free pass.
I mean, that is a fascinating internal dynamic. The tribe holds its own development corporation to the exact same rigorous standards as some massive outside company. So who is the actual authority figure managing all of this?
The structure is basically divided into two main pillars. You have the commission and the director. The commission is the oversight body. It's made up of 3 to 5 members. They're appointed to 3-year staggered terms. And there's a strong preference for Pawnee Nation members to fill those seats.
And what's their day-to-day role?
They hold the formal hearings, they issue legal rulings, they have actual subpoena power, and they can petition the tribal court. Think of them as the judicial and oversight arm.
Got it. And the director is the executive arm.
Exactly. The director manages the daily operations. They're the one hiring the compliance staff, managing the funds, establishing the specific hiring goals for contractors, and actually dispatching officers out to the job sites. The director is the one actively managing the battlefield, so to speak.
I look at these roles and I just think about human nature. If I'm a massive multinational construction conglomerate, I might look at a local tribal director and think, look, I have a multi-million-dollar budget and a whole team of corporate lawyers. I'm just going to bulldoze my way through, use my own crew, and completely ignore this local preference order.
It happens.
Right. Do the director and the commission actually have the teeth to stop a giant corporation from doing that?
Oh, the teeth are incredibly sharp, and they are specifically designed to shatter that exact kind of corporate arrogance. If a contractor tries to operate without an approved compliance plan, or if they violate the preference laws, the director can levy fines of $1,000 per violation per day.
$1,000 a day. But see, a massive corporation might just view that as a minor tax. They might just say, fine, whatever, we'll eat the $1,000 a day because it's honestly cheaper than reorganizing our entire workforce.
And that is exactly where the real leverage comes in. It does not stop at fines. The director and commission can order a complete, immediate project shutdown.
Whoa!
Yeah. They can legally deny a corporation the right to conduct any further business within the jurisdiction.
So the project just stops? The investors are furious? The timeline is completely blown?
It stops dead in its tracks.
Yeah.
And if a stubborn contractor decides to just abandon the project and refuses to pay those accrued monetary damages after the whole appeals process is exhausted, the commission holds a nuclear option. They can petition the tribal court to officially order the Pawnee Nation police to physically confiscate the contractor's property on site.
Are you serious?
Dead serious. We are talking about seizing heavy equipment, materials, vehicles, and literally selling them to pay the outstanding damages.
Okay, seizing excavators and selling them off, that completely changes the math for a contractor. You cannot just absorb that as a cost of doing business, which logically brings us to the front gate of the project. Because the commission has such devastating enforcement power, a contractor simply cannot just show up and start digging. The entire process has to be settled before a single work boot touches the dirt.
Through what is called a compliance plan.
Here's where it gets really interesting. I like to think of the compliance plan as a legally binding construction prenup. Every single detail is negotiated before the marriage even begins. There are 0 surprises. You agree on exactly who gets what the fees are, and what the exact headcount will be.
That's a perfect way to look at it.
So let's look at the financial part of that prenup first. The Tero fee. Because before you can even operate, you have to pay into the system, right?
Right. The employment rights fee is mandatory, and it's scaled based on the total cost of the project, which includes everything: equipment, labor, materials. But it functions almost like a regressive tax.
How so?
Well, for a smaller project, say between $100,000 and roughly $1 million, the fee is 4%. But as the project grows, the percentage drops. It goes down to 3% for projects up to $10 million, 2% up to $15 million, and then just 1% for massive projects over $15 million.
That structure makes a lot of sense. If you hit a massive $50 million infrastructure project with a flat 4% fee, you might just scare off the developers entirely. By scaling the percentage down as the project cost goes up, Tero incentivizes large-scale development while still guaranteeing that a really significant proportional chunk of capital is injected directly into the tribe's training and operational funds.
Exactly.
And this fee must be paid up front.
Absolutely. Paid in full prior to commencing work.
Yeah.
No fee, no project.
Wow. Okay, then we get to the human element of the prenup, which the sources indicate is a massive sticking point. The core crew.
Oh, yeah. This is where a lot of the battles happen.
I bet. Because every contractor has their trusted foreman, their specific machine operators, people they've worked with for years. They want to bring them all.
And the Pawnee Nation actively restricts that to maximize local employment. What's fascinating here is the definition of a core crew employee is just incredibly strict. A contractor cannot just point to a guy and say, he's core crew because I like how he works, or, hey, he did a great job for me on a project last month in Texas.
Right. To legally classify someone as core crew, they have to meet very rigid criteria. They must have been on the employer's annual payroll for no less than 1 full year, or they have to be an actual owner of the firm. Or they must possess highly specialized, unique qualifications that are undeniably essential for the business to operate. You can't just slap a specialized label on a general laborer to sneak them past the gate.
You absolutely cannot. And even if a worker magically meets those strict criteria, the contractor doesn't have the final say.
Tero does.
Yes. Every single core crew position must be evaluated and approved in writing by Tero in advance. This ensures the contractor is only bringing in the absolute bare minimum number of outside workers necessary, leaving the vast majority of the actual job openings for the local Native American workforce.
And what if the prime contractor needs to subcontract out pieces of the project? Does the preference mandate apply to the businesses they hire?
Heavily. Tero utilizes a highly structured tier system for contracting and subcontracting. Preference must be given to certified Native-owned firms.
And I imagine contractors try to game this all the time, right? They might find a Native American citizen, give them the fancy title of CEO, but the actual corporate entity is run by non-natives pulling the strings in the background.
Oh, it's a known tactic, exactly. Which is why Tero certification is not just checking a demographic box on a form. It is a rigorous audit. It requires a $500 application fee, strict proof of at least 51% Native ownership, and most importantly, proof of control.
Meaning they actually run the place.
Right. Tero investigates to ensure the Native owner actually exercises majority control over the day-to-day operations and receives profits that genuinely match their ownership stake. They actively hunt for those front companies. If a business passes, there is a 5-tier system for awarding bids that prioritizes certified Pawnee businesses first, then other Native-owned businesses.
Okay, so the prenup is signed. The compliance plan is approved, the fee is paid, the core crew is locked in, and the Native-owned subcontractors are prioritized. The project officially begins.
Time to get to work.
Right, but because that compliance plan locks in the exact number of outside workers, it forces a massive logistical reality. When the contractor needs more hands, they can't just put an ad in the local paper or call a temp agency. That brings us to the operational workflow, specifically the Tero hiring hall.
Yes. When a contractor needs workers, whether that's general laborers, carpenters, heavy equipment operators, whatever, they must submit a manpower request form to the Tero hiring hall. And here's the kicker. They must give Tero a minimum of 48 hours notice before the worker is actually needed on site.
Okay, I have to play devil's advocate here on behalf of a stressed out project manager. Commercial construction is basically organized chaos. The weather changes, a concrete truck is arriving tomorrow morning, and I suddenly realize I am short 3 guys. Waiting 48 hours for a worker sounds like a logistical nightmare that could delay a massive pour. How does Tero balance the fast-paced reality of construction with this strict preference mandate?
It is probably the most common point of friction, honestly, and it fundamentally forces contractors to just become better planners. The 48-hour rule exists to ensure local natives aren't bypassed simply because of a contractor's poor time management or their desire for convenience.
Right, I needed a guy yesterday, so I just hired my buddy.
Exactly. But Tero is not trying to sabotage the project's timeline either. The system has a built-in release valve.
How does the release valve work?
If the hiring hall searches their database and simply cannot find a worker who meets the minimum qualifications within that 48-hour window, they don't leave the contractor hanging indefinitely. Tero will issue a formal written certification stating that no qualified native worker is available.
Oh, I see.
Yeah. And only with that specific document in hand is the contractor legally permitted to go hire from the outside market.
That makes total sense. It forces the contractor to try the local market first, but gives them a clear legal path forward if the specific skill set just isn't there at that exact moment. Now, once Tiro dispatches those local workers and they are actually on the job site, how does the office ensure they aren't being exploited? Because if a contractor is forced to hire locally against their will, they might try to cut costs by underpaying those workers.
Wage parity is a huge cornerstone of the Tero Act. Dispatch workers must be paid a rate exactly equal to the employer's core crew or non-native employees who are performing the exact same duties. And on a lot of these projects, especially federally funded ones, this triggers the Davis-Bacon Act, meaning contractors must pay prevailing wages.
And they can't just, promise they're paying prevailing wages. They have to prove it mathematically every single week. This is where the infamous U.S. Department of Labor form WH 347 comes in.
Yes, the Certified Weekly Payroll Report. Submitting this to Tero is absolutely non-negotiable.
And looking at how this form functions, it is basically a mathematical trap for wage theft. A contractor can't just list a worker's name in a lump sum payment. They have to document the exact work classification for every single hour worked. They have to break down straight time, overtime, every cent of gross earnings, and every single deduction.
Precisely. If a contractor tries to take a highly skilled native electrician and classify them on paper as a general laborer, just to justify paying them a lower hourly rate, the WH 347 forces them to document that lie. And the form includes a signed statement of compliance. Falsifying it subjects the contractor to federal, civil, or criminal prosecution.
But, paperwork can be manipulated if nobody is verifying it in the real world. Tira doesn't just sit in a nice air-conditioned office reading payroll forms all day, do they?
Not at all. The actual verification happens in the mud. Tero compliance officers conduct unannounced job site visits.
Ooh, surprise inspections.
Completely unannounced. And this is where they catch those classification lies. If the paperwork says a worker is a laborer, but the compliance officer walks onto the site and sees that worker pulling complex electrical wiring, the contractor is caught red-handed. The officers interview workers privately, they verify prevailing wage rates, and they inspect safety conditions.
They also audit the tribal vehicle policy, which I think is just a brilliant level of operational oversight. If tribal vehicles or resources are being used, Tiro officers are out there checking that drivers have valid licenses and, crucially, that tribal-issued fuel cards are being used properly and not being abused for personal gain. They are guarding the physical assets of the tribe in real time.
And we should definitely note that Tero's oversight extends far beyond just construction sites and heavy machinery. They also manage an artist certification process, which is a really vital part of the economic landscape there.
I found this fascinating when looking through the sources. It ties economic opportunity directly to cultural preservation. Tiro ensures that Native American art produced and sold within the jurisdiction actually meets traditional standards. They verify the artist's tribal affiliation and grant them a certified identifier.
It's brilliant.
It really is. It protects consumers from counterfeit native art, and it dramatically increases the marketability and value of authentic work for local artists.
It just proves that Tero is a comprehensive economic engine, not just some construction regulator. But, regardless of the industry, whenever you overlay this kind of strict tribal regulation onto standard corporate habits, you're inevitably going to get friction.
So let's dig into those friction points. Where do outside companies usually trip the alarms and find themselves facing those $1,000 fines?
The biggest alarm usually goes off in the HR department. Standard corporate HR handbooks are basically completely incompatible with Tero law in several key areas. A major one is drug testing. In mainstream corporate America, it is standard practice to require a drug test from an applicant before you even offer them the job.
But under Tiro, that is completely illegal. Employers must make a formal offer of employment first, and only then can they require the pre-employment drug test. If a company just runs their standard recruitment playbook, they are instantly in violation. So, what does this all mean? The most dramatic clash between corporate habit and tribal law happens at the very end of the employment cycle. Layoffs and terminations. Let's go back to our prenup metaphor for a second. When the project winds down, the divorce happens, and people have to be let go.
Right, and in a standard corporate setting, management decides who stays based on their own internal metrics, or sometimes, honestly, just arbitrarily. But under Tero, Layoffs are dictated by a strict reverse preference system.
Reverse preference.
Yes, if a layoff is necessary, a native worker with skills equal to a non-native employee absolutely must be retained. The non-native worker goes home first. No exceptions.
That completely upends the standard at-will employment concept that most companies totally rely on. And what if it's not a layoff? What if a manager just wants to fire a native worker because they feel their performance is slipping? In corporate America, you can often just call them into an office on a Tuesday and hand them a pink slip.
Well, if a manager tries that on Pawnee Nation land, they are going to trigger a massive legal headache. An employer cannot simply fire a Native American worker on the spot for performance issues. They are legally required to discuss the potential termination with Tero prior to taking any final action.
Wait, they have to justify it to the government first?
Yes, they do. They have to present a thoroughly documented paper trail of warnings and performance issues leading up to the termination. The only time a manager can bypass Tero and issue an immediate dismissal is in cases of deliberate safety violations, malicious damage to property, or, acts of violence. For anything else, the corporate policy bends to the tribal law, not the other way around.
This raises an important question about corporate adaptability, right? Because this also creates a massive power shift when it comes to labor unions. Normally, a powerful union dictates the terms of a site, but under Tero, the law expressly supersedes union agreements.
Exactly. If a contractor has a collective bargaining agreement with a labor union, that union cannot just operate as usual. The union itself must sign a written agreement with Tero, legally binding them to comply with the act.
Wow.
Furthermore, Tero fiercely protects the worker's paycheck from mandatory union interference. A worker cannot be forced to join a union or be forced to pay union dues or fees as a condition of employment within the jurisdiction.
It is just incredibly comprehensive. They even protect what the law calls underutilized workers. If a worker is called in on a part-time or on-call basis, they are legally guaranteed a minimum of 2 hours of pay just for showing up to the site, even if the contractor changes their mind and sends them home 5 minutes later.
It stops contractors from abusing local workers with erratic, unpaid scheduling.
Right. Every single loophole a contractor might use to exploit the local workforce or cut corners has been anticipated and mathematically closed.
It really is a brilliantly designed architecture for economic sovereignty.
So let's synthesize what we have unpacked today. Tero is not a suggestion box. It is the total regulatory reality of the Pawnee Nation. From the meticulous 2-week lead time for the compliance plan prenup, to the mathematically rigorous WH-347 payroll traps, to the reverse preference layoff rules, Tero ensures that the Pawnee Nation maintains absolute, unyielding control over its own economic landscape.
And they enforce that reality with crippling financial penalties, immediate project shutdowns, and the ultimate authority to use the Pawnee Nation police to seize corporate assets. I mean, it is true. Sovereign power in action.
So, to you, the listener, whether you are sitting at a desk as a commissioner enforcing these regulations or you're a contractor out in the mud trying to build a bridge, respecting this framework is about much more than just avoiding a fine. It is about understanding that you are operating within a sovereign nation. Every compliance plan filed and every Native worker hired and protected is a tangible step toward the economic independence of the Pawnee Nation.
The law ensures that the wealth extracted from the land ultimately serves the people of the land. It's that simple.
Exactly. Tero is a formidable mechanism for keeping wealth, skills, and opportunity inside the community, but it leaves us with a final thought to mull over. As these certified Native-owned businesses scale up, as they use the Tero tier system to grow their capacity, build massive portfolios, and eventually start bidding on giant federal contracts outside of tribal jurisdictions, how might the strict community-first principles they learned under Tero fundamentally change the way mainstream corporate America thinks about local hiring, community investment, and workforce retention? If this blueprint creates such powerful local resilience here, maybe it's time the rest of the country studies the architecture. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.